Ethan had long accepted that the world he lived in would always be dark. But what he didn't know was that the light he needed would soon find him in the most unexpected way. On a cold autumn evening, the streets of New York buzzed with life. Cars honking, people chatting, the distant sound of a street musician playing the saxophone. But for Ethan, the world existed only in sound and touch. He walked cautiously with his cane, counting the familiar steps to his apartment. The damp air carried the scent of rain, and a chilly breeze brushed against his face. Ethan had not always been blind. Just 6 years ago, he was a passionate musician, playing piano in small jazz clubs. Music was his life, his soul. But a tragic accident stole his sight, leaving him trapped in a world of shadows. Since then, life had been a monotonous loop. Wake up, navigate the city by memory, listen to the same old radio shows, and go to bed. Loneliness was a constant companion. As he reached the corner near his building, a strange sound caught his attention, a faint whimper coming from a nearby alley. He stopped, tilting his head to listen. Another whimper. It was weak, almost pleading. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't in the habit of stopping in dark alleys, especially not alone. But something in that sound pulled at him. Carefully, he turned toward the noise, using his cane to feel the ground ahead. The whimpers grew louder. His foot hit something soft, a small, shivering body. He crouched down and reached out hesitantly. His fingers brushed against damp fur. A dog. Then, weak and trembling. "Hey there, buddy," Ethan murmured. He could feel the dog flinch at his touch, but didn't pull away. For a moment, he sat there, rain beginning to drizzle, feeling the warmth of the fragile creature beneath his fingertips. He had no way of knowing what the dog looked like, but he could tell it was just as lost as he was. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir inside him. A connection. Ethan knelt on the damp pavement, his fingers gently running over the dog's frail body. Its fur was rough and matted, and he could feel the sharp outline of its ribs beneath his touch. This dog had been starving for days, maybe weeks. The rain had picked up now, a slow drizzle turning into a steady pour, but Ethan barely noticed. The dog let out another weak whimper, barely shifting under his hand. Ethan hesitated. What could he do? He could barely take care of himself. How was he supposed to help a stray? A rational voice in his head told him to walk away, pretend he never found it. But something inside him refused. "Come on, buddy. Let's get you out of the rain," he murmured, slipping his hands under the trembling creature. The dog tensed but didn't resist. Carefully, Ethan stood, cradling the small body against his chest. He had never carried a dog before, but he held on to it like something fragile, something that mattered. Navigating the streets with a cane was difficult enough. Doing it with a weak, half-conscious dog in his arms felt almost impossible. The occasional passerby brushed past him, too hurried to notice the blind man struggling through the rain. Ethan focused, counting his steps, relying on memory. Finally, he reached his building. With effort, he unlocked the door to his tiny apartment and stepped inside. He set the dog down on an old towel near the heater, then hurried to grab a dry rag. He carefully wiped the mud and rain from the dog's fur, listening to its slow, labored breaths. "You're a mess, you know that?" Ethan muttered, a small, almost amused smile on his lips. The dog huffed in response, curling up tighter. Food. The dog needed food. Ethan fumbled through his kitchen, finding a half-eaten loaf of bread and some leftover chicken from the night before. He shredded the chicken into small pieces and placed it near the dog's nose. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, The dog lifted its head, sniffed the air, and weakly licked at the food. "That's it, good boy," Ethan said softly, relief washing over him. As the night passed, Ethan sat nearby, listening to the rain tapping against the window. The dog, now full and dry, had stopped shivering. It wasn't much, but for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he had done something right. What he didn't know was that this one small act of kindness was about to change both their lives forever. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of soft breathing near his bed. For a moment, he forgot about the night before. But then, he heard the faint rustling of paws against the wooden floor. The stray dog. It was still here. Ethan carefully sat up, his fingers searching for the warmth of the small creature. When his hand met the dog's fur, it flinched slightly but didn't move away. "Hey, buddy, you made it through the night." He felt a wet nose pressed lightly against his palm, followed by the hesitant flick of a tongue. Ethan couldn't see the dog's expression, but he could feel the change. It was trust, small, uncertain, but real. But as much as Ethan wanted to help, he knew he couldn't keep the dog forever. His tiny apartment barely had enough space for himself, and money was always tight. He didn't even know if the dog belonged to someone. Maybe it had an owner out there searching for it. Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed the local animal shelter. "City Animal Rescue, how can I help you?" A woman's voice answered. "Hi. I found a stray dog last night. It's in pretty rough shape, but I was hoping someone might be looking for it. Do you have any details? Breed, color, any collar?" Ethan hesitated. I'm blind. I don't know what it looks like, but it's small and really underweight. No collar." There was a brief silence on the other end before the woman spoke again, her voice softer. "I understand. We can send someone to check it out." Ethan's fingers absently ran through the dog's fur. He expected to feel relief at the thought of handing the responsibility over to someone else, but instead, his chest tightened. "Actually," he hesitated, "what happens if no one claims him?" "Well, depending on his health, we'd place him for adoption. But if he's too sick, sometimes we have to make tough calls." Ethan didn't need her to explain. He understood what she meant. The thought of this fragile, trusting creature being put down just because no one wanted him made Ethan's stomach twist. "Never mind," he blurted out. I'll take care of him for now." He hung up before she could respond. The dog whined softly, as if sensing Ethan's internal battle. "Guess you're stuck with me a little longer," Ethan muttered, scratching the dog's ears. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. He had a purpose. Ethan decided the dog needed a name. Something fitting. "How about Shadow?" he mused. It felt right, the unseen presence always by his side. The dog let out a soft bark, almost as if in approval. The next few days weren't easy. Shadow was still weak, and Ethan had to learn how to care for a dog without sight. He listened to YouTube videos on dog training, asked his neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, for advice, and even called the vet to ask what Shadow should be eating. Their bond grew quickly. Shadow started following Ethan everywhere, his silent protector. The little dog had an uncanny ability to sense when Ethan was struggling, nudging his leg when he hesitated at a street crossing or pressing against his foot when he sat alone in the apartment. But not everyone was thrilled about Ethan's new companion. "You can't keep a dog in this building," Mr. Rourke, the grumpy landlord, barked one afternoon. "No pets allowed." Ethan tightened his grip on Shadow's leash. "I just need a little time. He's not a pet. He's helping me." "Doesn't matter." Rules are rules. Get rid of it, or I'll evict you. Panic settled in Ethan's chest. He had nowhere else to go. No family, no real support system. Shadow had become more than just a stray. He was the first living soul in years that made Ethan feel whole again. But what could he do? He was just a blind man fighting a world that refused to see him. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, gripping Shadow's leash, his mind racing. He had never felt this kind of helplessness before, not even when he'd lost his sight. Back then, he had convinced himself that he could still live a life of independence, that he didn't need anyone. But now, the thought of losing Shadow made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar fear. There had to be a way. A sudden idea struck him, one that might just change everything. With determination, he reached for his phone and searched for something he had never considered before: service dog training programs. If he could prove that Shadow was more than just a pet, that he was essential for Ethan's daily life, then maybe, just maybe, he could fight back against Mr. Rourke's eviction threat. The next morning, Ethan made a call. Vision Assistant Services, how can I help you? Ethan took a deep breath. I have a dog. He's a stray, but he's been helping me get around. I want to train him as a service animal. After a brief silence, the woman on the other end responded. That's certainly possible. Does he show an instinct to guide or protect you? Ethan glanced down at Shadow, who was curled up at his feet, ears perked up, as if he knew something important was happening. Yes, Ethan said firmly. He does. The woman explained that while most service dogs were trained from a young age, some dogs had a natural ability that made them excellent candidates. She scheduled an evaluation with a professional trainer for the next week. That night, Ethan sat beside Shadow, running his fingers through his fur. You hear that, buddy? You're gonna be my guide dog, he whispered. The thought made him smile, really smile, for the first time in years. The following week, the trainer, a woman named Lisa, arrived at Ethan's apartment. She spent an hour observing Shadow, testing his responses, and guiding Ethan through some basic exercises. Then she finally said, Ethan, this dog isn't just special. He was meant for this. Ethan's heart pounded. What do you mean? Lisa's voice was warm, full of certainty. Shadow is a natural guide dog. He senses your movements, anticipates your hesitations, and reacts instinctively to protect you. Most dogs take months, sometimes years, to learn that. But Shadow? He's already doing it. It's like he was waiting for you. Ethan swallowed hard, emotion swelling in his chest. Shadow hadn't just stumbled into his life. He had chosen Ethan. With Lisa's help, Ethan filed for Shadow's official service dog certification. And with that certificate, Mr. Rourke had no choice but to allow Shadow to stay. But this wasn't just about keeping a dog. It was about something bigger. Ethan had spent years thinking he was alone, only to realize that sometimes the help we need finds us when we least expect it. Ethan stood at the crosswalk, gripping Shadow's harness tightly. The city hummed around him, cars rushing past, distant voices calling, the scent of street food lingering in the air. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt safe. Shadow stood beside him, alert, his small frame steady despite the chaos of the streets. Ethan took a deep breath. Forward, Shadow, he said. With quiet confidence, Shadow led Ethan across the street, pausing at a slight dip in the pavement. Ethan smiled. The dog was already anticipating obstacles before they even came. It had been 3 months since Shadow officially became his service dog. In that time, everything had changed. Ethan no longer stumbled through life and uncertainty. Every morning, he and Shadow trained together, growing stronger as a team. Lisa, the trainer, continued working with them, refining Shadow's skills and helping Ethan navigate life with a guide dog. The transformation was remarkable. Ethan, once afraid to venture beyond the few blocks around his apartment, now walked with confidence. He could go to the grocery store without hesitation. He could take the subway without fear. Shadow was more than just his guide, he was his freedom. Even Mr. Rourke, the grumpy landlord, had softened. One afternoon, as Ethan returned from a walk, Rourke cleared his throat. "That dog of yours," he muttered. "He's impressive." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, he is." Rourke grumbled something under his breath before sighing. "Look, I was wrong. I see that now. He's not just a pet. He's your partner." Ethan nodded, understanding the unspoken apology. "Thanks, Mr. Rourke." Word about Ethan and Shadow's bond spread through the community. A local newspaper featured their story. Blind man and stray dog save each other. Soon, people started reaching out. A mother with a visually impaired son asked Ethan for advice on getting a service dog. A retired veteran struggling with PTSD wanted to learn more about the companionship of a support animal. Ethan realized something. His struggle had given him a purpose. With Lisa's encouragement, he began volunteering at the training center, sharing his journey with others. He spoke to groups about overcoming fear, about embracing help, about how the right companion, human or not, could change everything. Shadow had saved him, and now Ethan wanted to pay it forward. One evening, as Ethan sat on his small balcony, Shadow curled up at his feet. He reached down, feeling the soft fur beneath his fingers. "You know, buddy," he murmured, "I used to think I was meant to be alone. That losing my sight meant losing my future." Shadow let out a content sigh, pressing closer. "But then you showed up, and you proved me wrong." Ethan smiled to himself, a quiet, peaceful smile. Sometimes, the ones we save end up saving us. And sometimes, the things we fear the most, change, uncertainty, vulnerability, are the very things that lead us to where we're meant to be. And with that thought, Ethan stood, Shadow steady by his side, ready to embrace whatever came next.